Welcome to another TDF exclusive interview, and this time we have another UN rapporteur who is a guest of TDF 2025 joining us for this interview. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
If you could please tell us what exactly your area of expertise is.
So I am a professor of fiscal law and policy. Fiscal law is all the laws and regulations that are connected to finance. So your debt law, your tax laws, your procurement laws, laws on credit rating agencies. So that's one part of it. And then I also look at the spending part. So one is how countries collect money, both domestically, of course, and globally, and then how they spend it. And my UN mandate is specifically on cross-border transactions. So anytime money moves across a border, I get to have a look at it and try and analyze and understand it. Specifically debt, so foreign debt, taxes across borders, and illicit financial flows. And its implications for the standards of living of people, their ability to buy goods, their cost of living, inflation. So those interconnections and how they play and the effects.
That's quite an interesting area of expertise, and I can tell that well, there are many countries who are dealing with the issue of foreign debt right now. So can you please tell us how foreign debt can have an effect on the people living within certain borders? Do we have anything as good debt and bad debt?
I think that debt is neutral, but it's how you use it. It's what you get out of it. It's the manner it is utilized in that domestic scenario. But I want to talk about the life of a human being so that we see where debt has its implications. So 1 year before a child is born, parents are having the conversation about having children. 3 months later, the child is born. Now let's assume that when those two parents are making that conversation about having a child, right? That's when a government is thinking about taking on a debt, okay? 3 months later, a child is on its way. 9 months later, a full year later, hopefully the child is born, and the child is born healthy, right? And then goes into school and lives their life. Now, what you have in many scenarios in the life of that child is the mother takes nutritional supplements. Often countries give these nutritional supplements to mothers for free, and that comes from the financing part of it. When the mother goes into hospital, it could be a cesarean section, it could be a normal birth, right? Again, government is paying for the health care. The child then needs vaccines. These are free, polio, measles. And then the child goes into school and it's a free education system. But free comes at a cost. It still has a price. So if a country was making a decision to build a new train network, when we are thinking about this child being born, then what starts to happen is 3 or 4 years on, that money should have been invested into the country's train system. It should now be built. People should be moving around, working, getting to work easier, setting up businesses along the train stops, right? And so then you have the economy being generated. Now, when that money isn't spent right, then you have a problem. Because when you fast forward 5, 6, 7 years later, the country now has to pay interest rates. And where is it going to get it from? It's going to get it from the taxes it collects from its domestic population. So if it didn't invest it well, and it didn't have a generation of income that it could then tax, then you have a problem. And many countries, when they take on foreign debt, tend to extend the repayment cycle. So instead of paying within 5 years, sometimes they're paying within 15 or 20 years. Now this is when you really started to see it in human beings' lives, because if that investment didn't pay off, then children born after this child that we're talking about may not get free vaccines. Their mother may not get free cesarean sections. There may be no school feeding programs because now the money is being redirected. So the money that would be normally spent cannot be spent where it's normally spent, and the taxes that would have been collected aren't. And so you have this sort of stress on the economy, and then the government starts looking for alternative revenue. And if I add in, COVID, which everybody went through, then COVID threw everybody's economies into disarray. So if a country took on debt before COVID, chances are that it's defaulting without a doubt. And that's sort of the knowledge you start to hear right now happening across the world, because countries are struggling to pay off debt, especially the debt they took before COVID.
So, as part of your mandate, do you also scrutinize on how the money, or let's say the debt that was taken, how is it spent? Is it spent in the areas that they were supposed to or not?
So sometimes you can and sometimes you cannot. So one of the biggest challenges facing global debt is the fact that debt agreements are private and confidential. So I would only see a debt agreement if it's leaked. So then I cannot really tell, and you cannot really assess. And actually, not even domestic populations can truly assess whether or not the debt was utilized the way it was supposed to be used, unless the government chooses to release it, because the IMF certainly doesn't. And if you take a private bond or debt from like high net worth individuals, an investment firm like BlackRock, for example, then again, those agreements are not public. So it's really about getting access and being able to understand it. And then we have the additional problem. Political cycles are like 5 or 7 years. But you already hear me talking about 15, 20, and 30 years. So very often the debt is taken on by a previous government, and it may be the opposition party now in government, right? And if it's the opposition party taking responsibility for a previous government spending, often the data is not so clear in many countries across the world. So it's hard even for that opposition that's coming in to actually now start to understand what's supposed to happen and going.
And as a UN rapporteur, do you send these reports back to the UN? What is the purpose of scrutinizing debt agreements?
So what I do is I write what I call thematic reports. So twice a year, I write a report to the General Assembly, and I write a report to the Human Rights Council, where I talk about a pressing issue that's facing the world. So for example, last year, I actually talked about the need to reconfigure the social contract, but also to understand debt from a very human perspective, which is where I developed this life cycle approach that I just described to you. So it's about trying to get countries to think about debt and taxes and illicit financial flows, not just as numbers, but as here's the impact on human beings. Here are the kinds of decisions you're making. And so this is the kind of work I do. The second task that we're given is to do country visits. So official country visits. Governments invite rapporteurs to come in. I've now done it for about 5 or 6 countries across the world. And then you go in and you try and understand the challenges the country is facing. But from outside, you already sort of know what interests you. And then you go in and you try and assist with them. So for example, in the case of the Bahamas, I looked at issues around climate change and climate finance, but also the fact that they had been grey listed. So these are like unilateral coercive measures. So I tried to also understand those implications and try to help countries find ways to get off those lists, to implement laws that can be useful for them. So each visit is very different and very special. When I went to Argentina, it was to look at debt specifically and their currency fluctuations.
It's interesting that you bring up Argentina, because that is also another very interesting case to follow. And since you've been there, could you please tell us more about how they were able to manage this debt?
I don't know if we can say that Argentina has managed their debt, because they are in a very deep financial crisis as we speak. Argentina's debt with the IMF, for example, I would say, is almost micromanaged. The Minister of Finance, I think, goes to Washington every 3 months to make reports on the payment cycle. I can tell you what they did that has caused some of the problems that they're having right now. The first thing is that they're unable to trace where the spending took place on some of their big debts from about 15, 20 years ago. So that has caused a really big challenge for the current government. The second challenge that they're really facing has been that same period involved a nationalization of dollar accounts, of foreign currency accounts. And the moment you nationalize foreign currency accounts, you destabilize your entire business sector, with the result that I think many businesses now operate foreign accounts rather than allowing the money to come in. Because money in an economy has 2 purposes. The first purpose is I give it to you, you give it to me, and it circulates, right? So we're all working. And then the second is, and then there's this little piece that's taken away that the government is taking as tax, and then they're using that to build your infrastructure. Now, if that money doesn't even enter the country, then you lose twice. You lose that ability to move it, and then you also lose the revenue, right? So nationalizing those accounts caused a lot of challenges. And when I was there, it was heartbreaking, frankly, because their currency was fluctuating incredibly. They had 5 different currency rates that were all official. So when I landed in the country, I remember it was like 248 pesos to the dollar. By evening, it was 284. 6 months later, it was 600. And a year later, it hit 1,000 pesos to the dollar. So can you imagine, nobody's salary has changed. And the value of your 1 peso is like 25 cents, right? So that stress was incredible. And they then had different rates. They had about 4 or 5 official government rates. And so people kept trying to, I think, game the system to try and get the better rate.
So I believe in what you do. Basically, you should be looking more for corruption and cases where the money is not being channeled in the direction it should be.
So yes, I can look at that, which I do, but I prefer to focus on the systemic problems. And I'll tell you why. Right now in the world, every single financial transaction on dollars goes through one system in the world, through the SWIFT system. If you're a country which has sanctions, and there are many countries that have sanctions in the world, you cannot use the SWIFT system. But it's one country making that decision. And that's a unilateral coercive measure, right? That's a financial measure. That's a systemic problem. So I can look at corruption, and it's absolutely within my purview, but I prefer to look at the systemic problems, which if we fix, can actually unpack a lot of the other issues. I find very often when we talk about corruption, that it's a symptom of that systemic problem that we're all facing. And so that's why I focus there. The second is that whenever people talk about corruption, it's always about developing country corruption. But actually, the way the system is set up means that the developed country that allows you to park money in their country doesn't get held responsible. So there are about 90 tax havens in the world today. There may be more, of different types. And all of these have like a slightly lower tax rate, a preferential rate for a certain type of business, for a high net worth individual, for a musician or an artist. And the result of that is that people who earn certain types of revenue will go to those countries and become nationals, or companies will be registered there. But the work they're doing is somewhere else. But if you're doing work here in Iran, then you must pay taxes in Iran, right? So for me, that's the bigger conversation, and the figures are much higher than corruption. So when you look at illicit financial flows, I think when I last checked, corruption was maybe not more than like 10 or 15% of the illicit financial flows crossing borders. But for example, corporate flows were hitting 60%. So if you tell me corruption, I'll tell you, no, there's bigger money that needs to be dealt with. And so that is where I tend to look at.
So just to wrap things up, what would you say would be the best solution to fix the problem?
I think we need a global financial institution that does not only dispute resolution, it houses global data. It takes on all the banking financial transactions, it does credit rating, but also it houses all the debt agreements and all the tax agreements so that we have a neutral space to go. And if a country is going to try and put unilateral coercive measures, then there should be a place to go and question it. So I want that neutral entity to exist, and I think that the world is ready for it.
Thank you so much. That's all the time that we have.